Guys, welcome back to our channel. If you guys haven't seen the part 1 and part 2 of this, which is the chapter 9, which is part 1, I have put separate videos for part 1 and the part 2, so you guys go and check that out before seeing this video, which is the 10th chapter of part. Okay, so let's get started. So before you read, many years passed and Ernest was now a man of middle age. To his neighbors, who never suspected that he was anything more than an ordinary man and a familiar face, he was the only humble and hardworking and very thoughtful person. But what about the old prophecy? Was it ever fulfilled? Let us read and find out. So what happened here was, many years was passed and Ernest was not a child anymore, and he was a middle age, which is a man, and he was still very thoughtful and kind, and their neighbors didn't know that they just thought he was a man. So just read to find out. But what about the old future thing, the thing that may happen in future, and was it ever like fulfilled? Or let's read and find out. So the years hurried on and on, brought white hairs upon the head of Ernest, and made wrinkles across his forehead and furrows on his cheeks. He was an old man, but not in vain. He had grown old, more numerous than the white hairs on his head were wise. So what was this? Was Ernest was very, getting old, and he had like wrinkles and furrows on his cheeks, which is like pretty much like wrinkles on your cheeks. Yeah. And then he was a very old man. He grew very old, but he just very numerous than the white hairs on his head. He was very wise in his mind, and Ernest has ceased to be obscure, unsought for, undesired, had come to the fame which so many seek. He had become famous beyond the limits of the valley. College professors and even the active men of the valley and of the cities became so far to come and see him and converse with Ernest. And he received with them a gentle sincerity and spoke freely with them of whatever came uppermost or lay deepest in his heart of their own. So while they were talking together, his face would brighten unawares and shines upon them with a mild evening light. So what happened here was Ernest was really nice, and he started to gain very he started to become popularity because he was so kind and he was very gentle, and he was just whenever people from like college professors and from various cities come and meet Mr. Ernest, and then whenever they come and interview them, or whenever they come and talk to him, his face would like brighten up. And now he just doesn't know that his face is like so bright, and then it just shines upon them with a mild evening light of smile. And then while Ernest had been growing old, while Ernest has been growing old, God had granted a new poet to this earth. He too was a native of the valley, but he had spent the greater part of his life in distant cities, pouring out his sweet music everywhere. Neither was the great stone face forgotten for the poet, and had celebrated in a poem. The songs of this poet also were found and celebrated it in a poem. Songs of this poet were found in the way to Ernest. He read them after his customary toil, seated on the bench before his cottage door. As he read, he lifted his eyes to the mountain. "O great stone face," he said, "in not his manly worthy to be like your likeness." The face seemed to smile, but did not answer. Now it did happen. The poet thought he lived so far away that he did not heard Ernest, but he thought much about his character and wished to meet this man who wisdom talked and walked on his hand with the noble simplicity of his life. So one summer day, therefore, arrived Ernest's doors, where the good old man holding a book in his hand, which he read, and when the finger between the leaves looked loving, the great stone face. "Good evening," said the poet. "Can you give a traveller a night shelter?" "Gladly," answered Ernest, and then added, smiling, "I think I never saw the great stone face look so hospitality as a stranger. So what happened here was, all this part was, there was this poet who was also like Ernest. He was really nice and showering his beautiful songs to everybody. But he was not in the place near the Great Stone Face. He was up. He was in the city places, and then one he asked the stone face, like, if he is this man worthy to be like your likeliness. I mean, he's asking the stone face that, can this man be can this man be who you are right now? Can this man be just like you? And the face smiled but did not answer. And but far away, Ernest didn't hear, but the poet also wanted to meet Ernest, and because of his character, and he wished to meet Ernest because of his simplicity of his life. And on a day, Ernest's doors was being knocked, and the good old man was holding the book. And then seated on the bench, they sat on the bench before his cottage door. As they lifted their eyes to the mountain, Great Stone Face said, Is not this man worthy to be your likeness? And then what happened was, he asked, can you give a shelter to me, which he called himself of the traveler, night shelter. Gladly answered Ernest, and he added the smiling, I never saw Great Stone Face looked so real to a stranger. So, and then this is the poet which was holding the books, and this is Ernest sitting at the starting bench of the cottage house. So the poet sat down beside him, and he and Ernest talked together. Never before had the poet talked with a man like Ernest, so wise and gentle and kind. Ernest, on the other hand, was moved by the living images flung out of the poet's mind. As Ernest listened to the poet, he imagined that the Great Stone Face was bending over to listen to. He gazed into the poet's eyes. Who are you, my gifted guest? He asked. The poet laid his fingers on the book that Ernest had been reading. You have read these poems, said he. You know me then, for I wrote them. Again and again Ernest exclaimed the poet's features and and he just was like looking towards the stone face, and he was like really just like the poet. The poet was just like the stone face. He shook his head and sighed. Why are you sad? Inquired the poet. Because, replied Ernest, all through life I have awaited the fulfillment of a prophecy, and when I read these poems I hoped that it might be fulfilled in you. You hoped, answered the poet, fainting smile, to find in me like the likeness of the Great Stone Face. I am not worthy to be its likeness. So Ernest is saying, I am not worthy to be like the stone face, and you are worth it. Whenever I read your books, I think you can fulfill this. So he was telling this poet, you are just like him. And then why not, asked Ernest, pointed to the book. Are those thoughts not worthy? You can hear them in distant voice of a heavenly song, but in my life, dear Ernest, has not corresponded with thoughts. I had grand dreams, but they have been only dreams. Sometimes I lack in faith in my own thoughts. Why then, pure seeker of good and true, should you hope to find me in a face of the mountain? The poet spoke sadly, and his eyes were wet with tears. So too were those of Ernest. At the hour of sunset, as had long been his custom, Ernest was to speak to a group of neighbors in the open air. Together he and the poet went to meeting place arm in arm, from where there could have been seen the Great Stone Face. Ernest threw a look of familiar kindness around upon his audience, and he began to speak to the people that was in his heart and the mind. His words had power because they agreed with his thoughts, and his thoughts had reality and depth because they had harmonized with the life which he had always lived. It was no mere breath, and there were words of life. A life of good deeds and selfless love was melted into them. The poet As he listened, he felt that his life and character of Ernest was the noble strainer of poetry that he had ever written. His eyes filled with tears, and he said that to himself, that never was there so worthy a sage, that mild, sweet, thoughtful face of glory of white hair diffused about it. Okay. And then at a distance, but clearly to be seen, high up in the golden light of the setting sun appeared the great stone face, with white mist sounds around it, like white hairs around the brow of Ernest. At that moment, Ernest's face looked on an expression so grand that the poet was moved to throw his arms up and shout, "Behold, behold! Ernest is himself likeness to the great stone face." And coming to the end of the story, then all people looked at them and saw that the poet said was true. The prophecy was fulfilled, but walked slowly homeward, still hoping that some wiser and better man than himself would by and appear bearing resemblance to the great stone face.